when I talked to, my white friends in the department, they were all doing independent studies with professors. They were all being mentored. So it was weird that I was being discouraged from reaching out to professors, from figuring out what are MFA programs and how does that look like.
What's good? I'm Nikisha Elise Williams, and this is Black and Published, bringing you the journeys of writers, poets, playwrights, and storytellers of all kinds. Today's guest is Yvette Lisa Ndlovu, author of the short story collection, Drinking from Graveyard Wells, a collection where readers are forced to overcome their discomfort and immerse themselves in the richness of African culture, custom, and language.
I once had somebody say you should provide glossaries at the end of your stories so people can understand what it's about. And I'm like, okay. And then the same person who gave me that feedback, later on, she had a story that had Latin in it, and the Latin wasn't translated, and there was no glossaries at the end. So I'm like, how come when it's an African language, when it's African culture and food, I have to provide glossaries at the end of my story?
As a Zimbabwean storyteller, Yvette's work is steeped in the myth-making she grew up with to help her make sense of the world. How she uses horror and surrealism to reimagine true stories from the founding of Lyft to the sacrifices of immigrants. Plus, why she says this collection would not exist without the mentorship of one professor. And the reason her work is for her family and community. The rest of us are just eavesdropping on the conversation. Yvette shares her truth next when Black and Published continues. All right, so first question, Yvette, when did you know that you were a writer?
I think my first memory of being really serious about writing was in high school. I think I was like 16 at the time. I attempted to write my first novel. It was about a girl called Mystique, and she had, the power to communicate with angels. And my poor sister, I would make her read that book and give me feedback. Bless her heart, she's always reading my stuff. So yeah, that was my first attempt at writing a novel, and that novel will never see the light of day.
Okay, so going from the age of 16 and making your sister read over your work and read your novel that you wrote, how did that love of writing and wanting to write a novel carry you through your life?
Yeah, I think in general, like myself and other Zimbabweans, we use storytelling and myth making to kind of process and understand the world around us. Like we've been through a lot. We had, hyperinflation where bread was $1 billion. We had like fuel crisis, and, we lived under a dictatorship since, 1980. And before that, it was a white regime, the Rhodesian regime, which was similar to apartheid in South Africa. So we use, myths and storytelling to kind of process that. So, for example, with, living under a dictatorship, there was this myth that the dictator was immortal. And so I kind of write about that in the book, in the story Turtle Heart, where we have this immortal leader who, eats the heart of a turtle and becomes immortal. So, myths like that are the way that we kind of process, what does it mean to live under a dictator who has the seat of power for, until they're 90, until they're really old, because that's when our last dictator passed away. He was like 96 years old. So, using myth making, using things like immortality to understand, that this is wrong. It shouldn't be this way.
I did find it. So now that's the word for it, myth, because I'm like, is this part of the folklore of Zimbabwean culture? Because I'm like, there is so much there. But before we get to that and talking about, living under dictatorship, living in this country that was first white occupation and then the revolution co-opted by a dictator, and incorporating those myths into your storytelling, was that something that you always wanted to do, to tell a story of your homeland and incorporate all of that culture and myth and folklore into the writing?
Yeah, definitely. So back home, we have these fables called Ngano or Ingwanekwane. And, it's a lot of, talking animals, witches, fables, and it's, really beautiful. So I wanted to lean into that and use that in my story. So I'm kind of like engaging with that old oral way of storytelling.
How did that carry you, I guess, professionally? Or like, when did you make the decision to say, okay, I'm going to write for a living? How does that look for your life?
Mm. So I've always had support from my dad. My dad loves reading, so that's been good. I know a lot of writers usually do not have support from their parents. And then in college, I was an English major, and that's where I actually started working on this collection. Before it wasn't speculative; it was completely realist. And I
Mm.
worked on it in an independent study with a Black professor, and it was really transformative working with him because I'd been discouraged by other white professors at the institution. And so working with him, he had been on sabbatical before, so I'd never worked with him before. And then I emailed him, as soon as he came back, and I was like, I've never done a class with you. Can you, do you want to do this independent study with me? And he was like, yeah, come along. And it was, really encouraging. And that was really to have that, affirmation. Of course, the stories were, really bad. I was in undergrad, but he was, really affirming, and I got that mentorship from him. And, it was so important to have a Black professor. And then when I graduated, I went on to my MFA. And then in my MFA, I kind of like wanted to reconnect with my roots, reconnect with Ngano and Ingwanikwani, and, use that mythology. So I scrapped most of the stories except one. And then the book took shape in my MFA program.
Can you talk a little bit about the importance of having mentors who affirm your work in an institution like an undergraduate writing program and a graduate writing program? Because I feel like had you not had that, we wouldn't be getting this book. And oh my God.
Definitely, you're right about that, because before the Black professor came back from sabbatical, I had, worked with a white professor, and then during office hours, I'd asked him, "Oh, I'm considering applying to MFA programs. What do you think? Can you give me advice? How should I go about this?" And he was very discouraging, said, "I'm not ready for MFA programs." And then I was like, "Okay, is there another professor you think I should work with in the department?" And then he said, "Oh no, the professors are too busy. Do not disturb the other professors with them." And I was like, "That's really weird," because when I talked to, my white friends in the department, they were all doing independent studies with professors. They were all being mentored. So it was weird that I was being discouraged from reaching out to professors, from figuring out what are MFA programs and how does that look like. And so when, it was the Black professor's Professor Mkoma Wangugi. And when he came back from sabbatical, that was really transformative. And I got the confidence to apply to MFA programs. And, he told me about writing, introduced me to other African authors and Black authors. And, that was, total game changer. So I think if, he hadn't come back from sabbatical, I would have been discouraged, to think I'm not ready for an MFA program. I'm not ready to reach out to professors and, and work with them.
And going into your MFA program and letting the collection really take shape as like mythological, fantastical, instead of being a realism collection, what I notice is that you don't do a whole lot of explaining. And then I guess, is it the traditional language? Is that the right way to say the traditional language? You don't do a whole lot of explaining. The way I was Googling words and phrases and trying to make sure that I understood. And so you force people to meet you where you are and your experience. Was that intentional when you were writing this collection, for you to be true to who you are and the community that you come from and the culture and your background, and not trying to explain for Black American audiences, white audiences, and things like that?
Yeah, definitely. I have a friend, she's also an author, Shingai Jerry Kakunda, and she told me this thing. I think a Caribbean writer said this. I can't remember which Caribbean writer said it, but it's that when you're writing, you're writing for your people, you're writing for your family. The rest of the world can overhear, but it's not for them. It's for your family. It's for your people. So, I'm writing for them, and everyone else can overhear and listen in. And that's how I've been thinking about it. And, not translating is a conscious choice, because I feel like, when we read, like things with like, French or Italian, when somebody writes, "Oh, I had pasta for dinner," in a book, they don't go like, "Oh, pasta, in brackets is an Italian dish," whatever. And I feel like sometimes when Black writers we're writing, we put things in parentheses to explain it. And I also think like, people taking the time, and I appreciate, Googling words. So taking the time to, to Google, I think it shows, respect and appreciation for the work. Because when we're reading, let's say like Shakespeare, that's old English. We don't really talk like that anymore, but people respect that because it's Shakespeare, and they do the extra work of Googling, what does this old English word mean? What does this phrase mean? So, if we can do that for, things like Shakespeare, I think we can do that for, books and stories from other cultures, because it's a thing of respect. When people don't want to, Google something when it comes from another culture, it shows that you don't think it's worth your time to, engage with that, to find out, what is this thing. And I think, it's beautiful, and it opens your worldview when you do that extra step of researching what is this thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I've read a few books by African writers from like Western Africa, but Zimbabwe is in the southern half of the continent, is bordering South Africa, yes?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, and so I haven't read much from like African writers, not of like Nigeria, Ghana, like that, Cameroon, that kind of area. So it was definitely different to confront it and then try to, well, what is this? What is this about? What do these words mean? What is this language? And then have an appreciation for it. But I wonder, in making sure that your reader had to confront that discomfort and then take the further step to want to engage with the work in that way. When it came to your publishing process, were you discouraged from standing firm on that by editors or anything like that, agents, anything?
No. So I've worked with the University Press of Kentucky, and the series that they do, they're actually really good about selecting. So it's the new poetry and prose series. So they select new fiction, and a lot of Black writers have published through that. A lot of immigrant writers. So I think they're doing, something intentional, trying to bring in new writers. So I've, appreciated working with, editors, and the editor that I worked with would ask questions, and I think that's how you, avoid, stifling people's creativity or their cultural backgrounds, is ask a question. I don't understand what this word is, in this context, how is it working? And then I can, explain, and then we can make a decision, based off of that, that question. So the publishing process has been good with the University Press, but I think with workshops, especially in undergrad, that's where the, why don't you, it's really interesting. Actually, my MFA program, I once had had somebody say you should provide glossaries at the end of your stories so people can understand what it's about. And, I'm like, okay. And then the same person who gave me that feedback, later on, she had a story that had Latin in it, and the Latin wasn't translated, and there was no glossaries at the end. So I'm like, how come when it's an African language, when it's, African culture and food, I have to provide glossaries at the end of my story, but then when it's Latin, there was no glossaries at the end. So yeah, I think there's a little double standards, because I think with Latin, it's a dead European language. People expect you to, go and Google it to, respect it and, find out what is that Latin. But with African language, it's like, it's too much work to bother to figure out what it is. So those are some, things that have happened in workshop when I'm like, okay, that's interesting.
I kind of wanted a glossary, but I was okay with Googling, and I understand it. Anybody who engages with the story collection will have to just Google and be okay with it if they want to understand, and that's not problematic. I just wondered what editors were saying to you. So can you talk more about like your publishing process and how that went coming from your MFA program?
Yeah, so I was, working on this collection in my MFA program, as well as a novel. And, I had been collecting these stories, and, it kind of took shape. And so my friend, LP, said, you need to submit this somewhere. And so I started looking into, small presses, university presses that were taking unagented and unpublished authors. And I came across, the University Press of Kentucky. They had this great series. A lot of Black writers, a lot of immigrant writers had been published through it. And so I, sent my work out there, as well as another couple of places. And then they got back to me first. And then it took shape from there.
Wow. So I didn't realize that you were unagented. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
let's get to the reading. Let's do a reading from one of your stories, and then I can ask you all of my questions because I made notes everywhere. And I do want to talk about the craft because on a line level, the sentences are beautiful. The metaphors are astounding. Like, it's out of this world to me. Like, I was like, I've never read no stuff like this.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Drinking from Graveyard Wells is a collection of 14 stories that explores the lives of Black women living under capitalism and patriarchy through social horror, fantasy, and Afro-surrealism. The tales include ancestors speaking from beyond the grave, immigrants who sacrificed their appendages and talents, and history being rewritten to remind readers Africa did it first. Here's Yvette.
This one is an Afro-surrealist magical realist piece about the surreal experience of being a Black immigrant in places like America and South Africa. And so I use the word kwere in this piece, which is a slur for immigrants that is used in South Africa. So this world is kind of like a hybrid of America and South Africa and their anti-Black immigrant policies. And it's called Home Became a Thing with Thorns. They take Jabu's eyes on a Tuesday morning. The snowflakes fall with an obscene tenderness outside. We're inside a sterile government building that looks like a cross between a DMV and a church. The building seems to be designed to keep any warmth out, lest the kwerekwere inside get comfortable. It is the kind of cold that takes hold of your bones and refuses to let go. My friend Jabu is a painter. With the stroke of a brush, he can put rainbows to shame. He likes to paint our homeland, the beautiful blue sky we left behind when home became a thing with thorns. The naturalization priest lays a hand over Jabu's eyes, and just like that, Jabu's beautiful brown eyes vanish as if they've never existed. The spot where his eyes used to be is as smooth as an arm. Jabu collapses to the ground and retches on all fours into a plastic bin. Jabu isn't the first to vomit during a naturalization ceremony, so the priests always have those little plastic bins stationed at every corner of the building. The priest's face sours, like it might if he spotted a fat rat scurrying into his kitchen. Jabu retches until there's nothing left to come out of him anymore. He dry heaves and wails for the rest of the ceremony. He can't even cry. They took his eyes. One never knows what the naturalization priests are going to take from a kwerekwere. The only thing we do know is that they will take something that you love. I remember my conversation with Jabu before the naturalization ceremony. I won't be a kwerekwere anymore, he'd said, his eyes lighting up at the prospect of his dreams coming together like pieces of a puzzle to a decent life. When I'm a citizen, I will take shifts at the power plants during the day and then paint at night. I'll save up to open up my own gallery. You'll see. I can't wait to brag to everyone that I have a friend with a gallery, I said. I watch Jabu on the floor now. The wretched of the earth are not meant to make art. We're supposed to be too busy surviving. The corners of the priest's mouth twitch upwards in delight at the humiliation. Another kwerekwere shown his place. Even though I too want to slump to the ground, I move towards Jabu and help him up. Come on, Jabu, I say. Stop it. I know it's cruel, but I have to be the stronger one. I can't let Jabu end up like Asha. God forbid he ends up like Asha. You're a citizen now, I remind him, giving him a squeeze. Forget your eyes. Were a small price to pay. They took, he whimpers, still unable to fully comprehend what happened. My eyes. You can find other ways to make art, Jabu, I say, pulling his hair back so he can retch some more. Others have it worse. Please, I don't want you to end up like Asha was our friend. While we picked up all the new language and tried to iron out our old accents like pressing the wrinkles out of clothing, Asha refused to learn the new tongue. It was her form of resistance. This place would take from us anyway, Asha said. Why not hold on to something? Then the priest took her language. No longer could she sing Stella Chiweshe and Nena Dembo songs that reminded us of the old weddings and parties from the homeland before everything was lost. She didn't eat for a month after she got her citizenship. We found her hanging from the ceiling on a Sunday night. It could be worse, I say again, trying to convince myself more than him. The naturalization priests don't only take body parts and voices. They can take away joy, names, love, beauty, songs, laughter, family recipes, music, and so much more. I shudder to think about. But that is the price of citizenship. I take Jabu home to the 2-bedroom apartment we share with 4 other queries, buy him a cane, and make inquiries into getting him a service dog. I will do everything in my power to ensure he lands on his feet. Our roommates know the weight of the taking. They've seen it countless of times. They saw it with Asha. So they allow Jabu to have one of the rooms by himself tonight, and Jabu doesn't speak. When I sing Chirara Mwana Wangu, a lullaby my gogo used to sing to me whenever I was restless, he keens until I can't bear to hear it anymore. Perhaps if Asha was here, she would have done a better job of soothing him with song. Before I bolted out of his room, he asked me, his voice a hoarse rasp, of what it once was. What do you think they'll take from you? His question haunts me. The naturalization ceremony is in a week. If I don't go through with the naturalization, they will send me back to the homeland. I worked so hard just to stay here, for that to be my end. Whatever the priests take from me, I will just have to live with it. I will sacrifice anything to stay here.
I think this story is really emblematic of like one of the themes that I found in the collection, which is what it means to be not only just an immigrant, but an African immigrant, even within the continent, because you have the stories about being immigrants in South Africa. But then too, it's also what it means to be an African immigrant in the United States. And I felt like that was just really prevalent even in the title of the collection. So why did you want to ground readers in that experience of being an other or outsider?
Yeah, it's basically, based off of my own experiences, living in the US. And then I have family that has, immigrated to South Africa, and, they've had, xenophobic experiences there as well. And just thinking about how immigrants have to, give up so much to move, to be allowed to stay. We have family separations, happening at the border. And, that's a form of, giving up something that you love. You have people giving up their language to assimilate. You have people, not seeing their family for years. And so I wanted to touch upon those experiences of how much, you give up for the safety of either citizenship or, moving to a new place.
What do you feel like you had to give up in immigrating?
Yeah, definitely my family, because I'm the only person from my family who's in the United States. My sister's in Europe, so my family's in South Africa. I still have some family in Zimbabwe, so it feels like we're all scattered around the world. And, it's really heartbreaking, but it's so hard because their visas, their borders, their flights. And so, they're not, able to be surrounded by community in the way that would be helpful.
I also felt like another big theme of your collection was money and capitalism and greed.
Yeah.
I'm thinking a lot about the story where you have the goddess Amali. Is that the right? The goddess Amali, and she leaves $5 for a girl who's struggling. And every time the girl spends that $5, she gets more money back and more money back until she starts to spend it on herself. But then she feels so guilty that now she's just trying to take care of everybody around her. And I felt really bad for the character that, like she didn't even feel like she deserved it or was or had earned it or was worth the value of what she had of the gift. And in the end, she's like, I wish I had never found it. I walked right by it. How does money create instability in the life of an immigrant when there's so much, I guess, so many responsibilities tugging on you?
Yeah, with that story, I wanted to, explore Black text as well as Black immigrant text, and that, when you're the person that makes it out, you're the person that, goes to America or Europe or any of these places that are considered, the land of milk and honey, the land of opportunity, there's this kind of responsibility that you have to, send money back to make sure and take care of everybody. So, I've, sat down with a lot of other African immigrants, and we've talked about, there are people paying entire school fees, hospital bills, groceries, for people back home. And, that takes a toll on you because, you're out here, you're trying to survive as well in America, and you have, all these family to take care of back home. So I kind of wanted to, explore that, you want to take care of people, but it also takes its toll on you both financially, mental health. And a lot of people are alone here. So there's nobody to share that burden with. So those are the things that I wanted to explore with that story, just like the financial and mental health impact of, living away from home and having the responsibility to take care of everybody.
The second story in the collection, about second place.
Yeah. Second place is the first loser.
Second place is the first loser, which reimagines the founding of Lyft.
Mm.
And so I had to Google to make sure, like how much of this is true and how much of this is fiction, because I wasn't aware that Lyft was founded after the founder had gone to Zimbabwe and saw this method of ride sharing. So why that story and why the way you did it?
Yeah. So, I'm always fascinated with how, white people can go someplace and discover something. We have these beautiful falls, the Victoria Falls back home, and the Tonga tribe was living around that falls, and there's mythology about it. There's all this culture around it. But then when a white traveler came, a white colonizer came, in the history books it's mentioned that he discovered the falls. But how is that possible when there were indigenous tribes living around the waterfall, and it was indigenous guides that took him to the waterfall to show him? But in the history books it says that he's the one who discovered the falls, which is completely false. And he named them, after, an
Queen
English
Victoria.
queen. Yeah, exactly. So, something I was thinking about that with the founding of Lyft, because, Lyfts back home were, this kind of like community rideshare where if somebody's going in the same direction as you, you'd hail them down, they'll pick you up and they'll, take you, and you'd give them a small tip of thank you. It wasn't a really big like capitalist thing. It was just like a way of saying, you'd give them a few dollars to say, oh, thank you for taking me along the way. And it was a beautiful thing because, we didn't have a consistent public transportation system. So, this is a way of people, helping other people to move around. And it's, really, I think it was a really beautiful thing. And then the founder of Lyft, went to Zimbabwe and, discovered this form of rideshare. And then he made the app. And we called them Lyfts, which is Lift. And then when he founded it, he changed the spelling to Lyft. And so, I was just thinking about that, what is, discovery? And then, I think ride shares are kind of considered an American, invention and like, app. So thinking about how this African indigenous thing was made into a capitalist company, it was a nice thing that people were doing for themselves because they saw a need in the community. But now it's being turned into this corporation that exploits drivers, Uber drivers, Lyft drivers. They don't have healthcare. They, work long hours. They don't get a lot out of it. So it's kind of turned into this kind of like evil capitalist corporation. So thinking about that. And then also, I wanted to imagine, what did it look like for him to come to, Zimbabwe and, do this? So I invented a character of, his friend. And then I also, found out that the founder of Lyft, one of them went to Cornell, which is where I went for undergrad. So I started, piecing everything together, be like, okay, so that means, the character could have been somebody like me, an international student who brought their friend back, and then their friend, sees, Lyft and says, oh, what if I made this into a company and brought it back to America? So that's kind of like how it took shape. I'm thinking about, historically, what does discovery, mean, and who is given credit for innovative ideas.
Yes. And so, and that's what I mean about talking about how the role that capitalism and greed and money plays in a lot of the stories throughout the collection. And that's just one example of it. And it's the father who says, the character of the father in that story who says at the end, what you just said, that it's sad that he took a really beautiful thing and, profited off of it. There are also a lot of grandmothers in the collection, which I loved. Why was it important for you to always include these elder women in the lives and the stories of your characters in this collection?
Yeah, I think grandmothers, go-go's are so important to my life. I think Black elderly women are always the cornerstones of our community. So, whenever, you need something, whenever you need somebody to talk to, there's always, an elderly Black woman, there for you. So I wanted, that joy and care to, to come from them in the collection.
And you also have a lot of folks speaking from beyond the grave, a lot of incarnation, and then a lot of also just like magical. I think it's The Soul Has No Rainbow, where the goddess becomes human and she has all these recipe books and the cookbooks and things like that. Is that part of like Zimbabwean folklore that you incorporated, or was that something that you kind of just had fun with on your own?
Yeah, I believe, in the ancestors. So, there's this belief that even if you're gone, you're still, alive in some form as an ancestor, and you still impact, the living in that way. So that's, kind of where that, that comes from, that relationship with the ancestors.
Your title, Drinking from Graveyard Wells. I know that's one of the titles of the stories in the collection. Where did that come from?
That actually comes from a true story. So a lot of the stories are from, true experiences, and then I put a little bit of magic in them, but a lot of them come from real things that have happened. So Drinking from Graveyard Wells is telling the story of a community in Zimbabwe that didn't have access to piped water. And, the politicians had, received the funds to give them piped water, but they had pocketed all that money and kept on giving them promises to give them, piped water. And there's a lot of water inequality back home. And then, so as a solution, there was a graveyard. And so there was like a lot of water underneath that graveyard. So they dug a well in the graveyard. And, that's really dangerous to be taking water from so close, to dead bodies. So the water had embalming fluids and, a lot of that. And so that, that's really horrifying. And so that's what I wanted to talk about. And that's why I'm drawn to Afro-Surrealism. I consider a lot of the stories in the collection Afro-Surrealism. And Afro-Surrealism is about telling the narrative of the contemporary Black experience. These experiences being so absurd and horrific, that they seem, surreal and unreal. So, thinking a lot about, Jordan Peele's Get Out, that, using, horror, the fantastic to talk about very real issues. So Drinking from Graveyard Wells, that story is about talking about those horrific experiences of being forced to drink from a well in a graveyard because of, greed
and corruption.
Yeah, exactly.
Aside from like big themes of like greed and capitalism and money, and then also like the ancestors and elders, there's another undercurrent of the patriarchy and how women are treated. And I know you have a line in one of the stories like, there's only one way to break a woman, and then we all know what that means. Why was it important for you to point out how, I guess, badly women can be treated, and it's treated as if it's normal or okay? Like the line about the couple, and they're walking, and the woman's like, oh, you're going to be rich and you're going to buy me a dishwasher. And then he lets go of her hand and says, that spoils a woman. I was like, wait, what?
Exactly. And again, that's based off of, real things. So I think, with this collection, I experience, both Blackness and womanhood in this world. So I wanted to touch on both, Blackness, Africanness, and being a woman in this world, and how we've normalized the abnormal. Things like Drinking from Graveyard Wells, stories like the ones that you've mentioned are real, but, when you read it in a story, it seems so horrific. It seems like a horror story, but these are real stories. These are real experiences. So I want to shine a light on that we've normalized the abnormal and, use the fantastic to talk about the patriarchy and how a lot of these things are normalized, but they are truly horrific and absurd.
You mentioned earlier that, when you're writing a book for your family, and everybody else is just kind of getting to witness what you've been creating for family and community. What is it that you want, not just your family, but also your community back in Zimbabwe, family there, and then I guess the African diaspora globally, to get from this collection that you spent so much care and time with?
Yeah, that African stories matter, African mythology, African culture. I go back to, the book I told you about when I was 16 that that I tried to write. And, at the time I was, reading American and British novels, and, all of those, they didn't have Black people. So I thought that, Black people, Africans could not be in books. And so that first novel that I tried to write, it was about a racially ambiguous girl because I didn't think, somebody dark-skinned could be a lead, a main character in a novel. And it was, set on some island that I had made up that was close to America because I didn't think like a story could be set in Africa. And so that affected the kind of stories I told because I had never witnessed Black girls in books. I'd never witnessed, African stories. And so, I want people to take away that our stories matters, that, Africans and Black girls, can be the heroes of, their own stories. And, we can talk about the things that impact us, and we can bring in our mythology.
And talking about not seeing yourself represented, and so you didn't even think to put yourself in the story. Did that affect you as you were going into your MFA program with such an ambitious collection?
Yeah. So, when I was, 16, a teenager, I was writing those very, white stories. And then when I went into undergrad, I, discovered, Black writers. I discovered, Black fantasy, Black science fiction, and it kind of, opened up my mind. And then working with a Black professor as well. So I was able to kind of get that advice about representing myself, about, not translating and, the importance of representation. So I think because I had, that very key mentorship, from, a Black elder, that going into my MFA program, I think I had a lot of confidence in bringing in my Blackness. So, that's the importance of having, mentors, having elders who can guide you.
Do you see this collection as being a way to inspire other writers from the continent to be true to themselves and tell their stories?
Definitely. And I think, just reading opens up your mind because, I'd never seen Black stories and I was writing, white stories. So, that's, there's something to be said about imagination that, if you can't imagine yourself, if you can't imagine a different world, you're never going to try to do the work to, to change things. I engage a lot with, Afrofuturism, and I'm always thinking about how people like Harriet Tubman were Afrofuturists because they had that imagination. They could imagine, a world where Black people are free at a time when that was an impossibility. Freedom was an impossibility, and they could imagine, a different world. And, that's Afrofuturism right there. That's imagination. So imagination is really important. I think stories are really important in, allowing Black people to imagine different things.
What do you imagine for Zimbabwe?
No dictatorship, first of all, just I think better leadership, because I think, the revolution was co-opted by very selfish people who are lining their own pockets, who are using the same methods that the white regime used to oppress us, and they're using those same methods. So I think, better leadership that has the people at heart, that, wants to see us succeed and wants people to live in their own country. A lot of Zimbabweans are scattered across the world. We should be living in our own land. So that's what I want for all the people living abroad to be able to return home and to have better leadership.
Thank you. So those are my questions about the book. I want to move to the speed round in the game before I let you go for the morning. So Great. What is your favorite book?
That would be Kintu by Jennifer Makumbi, who's a Ugandan novelist. It's this magical realist, Afro-surrealist family saga, but a intergenerational curse. And that book was considered too African to be publishable when she first submitted it to publishers in the UK and the US, I think. And then so she discovered an African publisher and she sent it to them. And when it became a success with the African publisher, that's when US and UK publishers were like, oh, okay, we're trying to republish it in in America and the UK. So, I think that inspires me a lot. Like, I want to write a book like that. I want to write a book that's, too African to be publishable.
Who is your favorite author?
It's actually a poet, Safia Auhilo. I just love the way she uses language, and poets really, really inspire me because they work at the line level and they have these really beautiful, beautiful sentences. And she has a novel in verse. So yeah, Safia Auhilo, that really beautiful language.
That makes sense because I can tell that you work at the line level because you have a really beautiful sentences. Like
Thank you.
I think I highlighted so much. It's crazy. What is your favorite song?
Favorite song. Right now, this artist, he's a Zim hip hop artist called Volts JT. He's like really young. I think he's like 20 or 21. And he, basically writes about like the struggle of being a Zimbabwean youth right now, being really disillusioned, like growing up with like no hope because, these fat cats, these politicians have lined their pockets and, there's nothing for, the youth to aspire to. And I listen to his songs when I'm writing. He has songs called My Streets. He has a song called These Days. So a lot of his songs kind of talk about this kind of like this hopelessness that I sometimes feel myself.
If money were no object, where would you go? What would you do? And where would you live?
In Zanzibar, in East Africa, I think it'd be nice to have like a beach house, just writing my books and not worrying about, anything else. So I actually co-founded a summer workshop for Black writers called the Voodoo Knots Summer Fellowship. And one of our dreams is that we can one day have a house in somewhere like Zanzibar where Black writers can come over the summer or whenever and just, write in East Africa for a while. So that's the dream. And I hope that dream comes true where I can, run this kind of house, a beach house somewhere.
I support this, like a residency like what Kehinde Wiley has with Black Rock in Senegal.
Exactly. We need more of that.
Yes. So many Black writers were once just like, I'm coming home.
Right, exactly.
So we've talked a lot about Afrofuturism and what that looks like. So if you could predict the future, what would you want to see?
Ooh, I think, just Black liberation on all levels, especially imagination, because I think, going back to, the imagination, I think freeing the imagination will help other things in all areas of society.
Okay, and then what brings you joy?
Being around friends, talking to family, being, with my community.
And what brings you peace?
A really good book and tea, just cozying up to a really good book.
All right, so a game is called Rewriting the Classics. What's the one book you wish you would have written?
So I always have this discussion about like the classics and canon and, creating a personal canon because, the classics, a lot of them are just, like white books. So I believe in creating your personal classic, your personal canon. And for me, Kintu by Jennifer Makumbi is, a classic to me. It's really brilliant. Again, the book that was too African to be publishable. I aspire to that. Like, I want to be too African to be publishable.
Name one book where you want to change the ending and how would you do it?
I guess going back to the classics, maybe like Romeo and Juliet. I know that's not a book, that's a play, but Romeo and Juliet, where they survive. Maybe they have a couple of iPhones and they can call each other so they don't have that miscommunication that leads to their death, or they have magic or something.
Now, that would be a book I'd read, like a retelling of Romeo and Juliet where they live in the end and they have like modern technology to outsmart their family feud. That would be interesting.
Yeah.
And then finally, name a book that you think is overrated and why.
Well, that's a messy question.
It is. It's a very messy question. It's an intentionally messy question. So I'll let you answer it however you desire.
I would say, and this is a poetry book, Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur. But I will say that I also find it really inspiring in a really weird way because, here you have, this book, which I think, is a little overrated and the poems are kind of like simple and surface level. But, this brown poet, this brown author has achieved a lot of, success with it. And I think, I don't know, I support Black and brown mediocrity because a lot of, especially white men, just are rewarded for mediocrity. Yet, when you're Black and brown, especially a woman, you have to be excellent just to receive, half of, what they have. So, And I think, I love, Black excellence and that sort of thing. But sometimes I feel like it can be a trap that, keeps you working, keeps you from resting. So, yeah, I support Black and brown mediocrity in a lot of ways. So, even though I think Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur is a bit, overrated, I fully support, seeing, more Black and brown people, being rewarded for, or just, simply being mid and being rewarded for it, like, their white counterparts.
I support that answer. I'm here for Black mediocrity too. Like, Black excellence is amazing, but Black mediocrity, we should also be allowed to be mediocre or average, and that be enough.
Exactly.
And so now my final question for you today is, when you are dead and gone and among the ancestors, what would you like someone to write about the legacy of words and work that you left behind?
Never been asked that before. So I'll be thinking about that question like a lot. I think something like, I did with African stories and African mythology what, Beyonce has done, with music, or Michael Jordan with, with basketball, Michael Jackson with music. So kind of like, yeah. Yeah, I'm just trying to do, things with African mythology and African stories, and I hope, to be remembered that way.
Thank you so much, Yvette. This was awesome.
Thank you. And such great questions. I really love this conversation.
Big thank you to Yvette Lisa Ndlovu for being here today on Black and Published. Make sure you check out Yvette's short story collection, Drinking from Graveyard Wells, out now. And if you're not following Yvette, check her out on the socials. She's at Lisa_Teabag on Twitter and Instagram. That's our show for the week. If you like this episode and want more Black and Published, head to our Instagram page. It's at Black and Published, and that's BLK and Published. There, I've posted a bonus clip from my interview with Yvette about finishing her last semester of her MFA program and preparing to query her first novel. Make sure you check it out and let me know what you think in the comments. I'll holla at y'all next week when our guest will be Laura Worrell, author of Sweet, Soft, Plenty Rhythm.
I know this isn't for every reader, but for me as a reader and thus as a writer, I like stories that reflect the complications of life, that life isn't always going to offer happy endings, and that there is meaning even when the ending isn't happy. And I guess that's what I'm trying to leave readers with, is that there is always the opportunity for us to change our lives.
That's next week on Black and Published. I'll talk to you then. Peace.